If there's one thing I've learned living in the countryside, it's that there will always be someone who thinks they can do whatever they want with other people's property. There are people who think that a fence is an optional decoration, that a piece of land without a house automatically becomes a free area, and that, somehow, the lack of a big sign saying, "You are invading," means that they can enter at will. But never, ever in my life did I imagine that someone would go far enough to organize an entire wedding on my property without even telling me. And yet, that's exactly what happened. The person responsible for this feat of sheer audacity? A certain woman from the neighborhood who went by the nickname HOA Karen. And if you don't know what an HOA is, consider yourself lucky. HOAs like this are known for having despotic presidents who believe that a suburban neighborhood is a little monarchy where they can make up their own laws. The problem is, where I live, there is no HOA. That didn't stop this woman from proclaiming herself president of an association that no one recognizes, making up rules, and apparently starting to rent out land that isn't hers for wedding events. Yes, because that's what she did. The whole thing started when a friend called me to ask if I'd started working with events. Events? I asked, confused. Yeah, I heard your property is being used for a wedding next Saturday. I nearly choked on my coffee. I didn't rent anything. I never authorized anything. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I grabbed the keys to the truck and drove straight to the furthest part of the farm, where there is a large field with a few trees and enough space for a lot of guests. I got there, and, to my surprise, the field was already taken over by an entire production worthy of a magazine wedding. There were white tents set up, chairs lined up, an altar decorated with flowers, which weren't mine, because I don't grow flowers, and a dance floor being set up. Some people were carrying boxes. A guy was testing the sound with a microphone, and two girls were arguing about where the cake table would look best. It was as if someone had rented an invisible ballroom and chosen my farm as the ideal place for the event. I got out of the truck, looked around, and thought, no, I'm not seeing this. But I was. And then, of course, along came the owner of the idea. Karen came marching towards me, holding a clipboard as if she were managing a major enterprise. Her flowery dress and superior look only reinforced the idea that this woman really believed she was entitled to do this. Before I could ask her anything, she smiled and said, "Ah, you're just in time. We need to talk about the limits of the reception area." I blinked, trying to process the absurd information. "What's it like?" she sighed, as if I were a dumb child who couldn't understand something very simple. "The wedding will be here on Saturday. We'll need to make sure that the traffic doesn't interfere with the guests' experience." It was at that moment that I realized the level of the problem. She wasn't asking me for permission. She wasn't asking me if she could use my property. She had everything ready, as if it was obvious that it could happen, as if the farm was hers. I took a deep breath, because when the absurdity is too great, the only thing you can do is calm down before deciding how best to deal with a lunatic. And you sorted all this out without talking to me because this area is part of the HOA, of course. That's it again. There's no HOA here. She laughed dryly, as if I were a stubborn lunatic who refused to accept a universal truth. It's a community concept. Anyway, the space was empty, and it would be a waste not to use it for something as beautiful as a wedding. I looked around. Several workers were setting things up as if it were a festival. "And you didn't even think to ask before setting up all this tomfoolery?" She gave me a look of contempt. "Ask? It will benefit the whole neighborhood. The wedding will be beautiful, and will show that our community is vibrant and welcoming. You should be happy to be part of something so special. Of course, I should be thrilled, honored, grateful even, to have my property transformed into a free wedding hall without anyone even considering consulting me first. But that was all right. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to tear my hair out, because I already had an idea of what to do. If she wanted a country wedding so badly, Then I was going to give her a truly rural wedding, something really authentic, something that involved my goats. I've seen a lot of assholes in my life, but this woman took the art of slacking off to a level I didn't even know existed. Invading my land was absurd in itself, but turning my property into an open-air buffet without telling me? That was something from another planet. But I'm a patient man. When life gives you lemons, you can squeeze them and complain about the acidity, or you can make a nice juice and throw it in the face of those who annoy you. So instead of pulling Karen by the hair from my land, I just let out a long sigh and agreed. Yes, I agreed. Of course. That's fine. You got it. She looked at me a little suspiciously, as if expecting more resistance. But no, I gave her a polite smile, looked around with a neutral expression, and gave her a little nod, as if to say, no problem at all. You can go on with your madness. She was visibly pleased. She thought she had won, that I had been convinced by her community spirit. But deep down, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I came home with an idea in my head and went straight to the stable, where my goats were resting, waiting to be the big attraction of the party without anyone knowing yet. Now, if you've never had goats, let me explain something to you. Goats are a force of nature. They're not just animals. They are destroyers of worlds, masters of chaos, indomitable forces of agricultural and urban destruction. A well-fed goat can turn an entire garden into a devastated field in less than 2 hours. They climb where they shouldn't climb, chew things they shouldn't chew, and, above all, respect nothing and no one. In other words, the perfect presence for a community wedding. My pets were a special group. The leader of the pack, a large, hairy goat called Satan, had an impressive record of destruction. He had already escaped the fence 4 times, once to invade the neighbor's garden and devour an entire clothes line that was drying in the sun. He even ate his tights. And now, he was going to have a much bigger stage. On Saturday, I woke up early, got my coffee, and went out to the field to see the final preparations. The show was ready. The chairs were arranged in perfect rows, covered with white cloths. The dining tables were arranged under the tents, decorated with candles and flowers. The gigantic cake took pride of place, glistening in the morning sun. Karen was there, feeling like a queen. Dressed impeccably, she gestured to the workers, giving orders and making sure everything was absolutely perfect. Little did she know what was to come. At around 3 in the afternoon, when the guests started arriving, I went to the stables. It was time for the big show. I waited for the right moment. The ceremony was already starting. Everyone was standing, waiting for the bride to enter. The photographer was already in place, and the celebrant had just opened the book to begin the emotional speeches about love, partnership, and other nonsense that didn't matter to me at the moment. It was exactly at that moment that I unlocked the goat's fence and let them free into the glutton's paradise. Now, if you've never seen 16 hungry goats let loose at once, I don't know how to describe it to you. First, they stopped for a second. They smelled the new territory, and then the chaos began. Satan was the first to fire in the direction of the decoration. He didn't hesitate. He ran straight to the rows of chairs and jumped on top of the main table, knocking over bowls, plates, and a beautiful flower arrangement that had probably cost a fortune. The other goats followed suit. They spread through the wedding like an army of barbarians invading Rome. The guests started screaming. Someone tried to scare off one of the goats with a napkin, but this only made the animal more interested in the fabric. One of the bridesmaids tried to save the cake table, but, well, one of my young goats, called Demon, was already sticking his face in the icing. The groom, poor guy, he was trying to calm the situation down, until one of the goats decided that his jacket looked like an interesting snack. And Karen? Karen had a breakdown. She was shouting orders, waving her arms, trying to scare the goats away as if they were pigeons in a square. But, unlike pigeons, my goats weren't intimidated. Satan climbed onto the gift table and knocked everything over. Another goat found a barrel of wine and somehow managed to tip it over, turning the floor into a slippery puddle of disaster. And then, the final blow. One of the goats managed to get tangled up in the bride's veil. Yes, the veil. She tried to run, but the goat wouldn't let go. It turned into a scene worthy of a comedy movie. The woman pulled one way, the goat the other, and before anyone could intervene, the veil ripped completely. It was at that moment that Karen collapsed to the floor. The goats were still everywhere, munching on the leftovers from the disaster. The wedding had officially become an authentic rural event, the way Karen had never imagined. The fairy tale wedding Karen had imagined now looked more like a horror movie, run by a group of hungry and completely uncontrollable goats. Chaos had ensued, and every second that passed only made it more unbelievable. The wedding altar, which had probably cost a fortune in flowers and fine fabrics, now served as a toy for two of the smaller goats who decided to test their climbing skills. They climbed up and down, tearing off pieces of fabric with their teeth, while a third goat sniffed a floral arrangement and decided whether it was edible or not. The band that was there to play romantic songs and thrill the guests had already abandoned their instruments because no one could hear anything but the screams of the bride and the guests fleeing in despair. The keyboard player, a gentleman in a blue suit, tried to save his equipment, but it was too late. One of the goats made a flying leap and brought down the entire structure. The crashing sound caused more guests to scream as if they were being attacked by wild wolves. I, on the other hand, have never had so much fun in my life. Karen, who until a few minutes ago was parading around with that "I'm in charge of everything" look, was now kneeling on the floor, pulling at her hair, and shouting nonsense. "This is a nightmare!" she screamed, as if she were the victim of a Greek tragedy, and not her own arrogance. The poor groom didn't know whether to try to calm the bride down or retrieve his suit, which now had a hole where one of the goats had decided to bite. Some of the bridesmaids tried to help, but it was difficult to run in a long dress when you have animals jumping in all directions. One of the most beautiful scenes of the day was when one of the older goats, a big male called Beelzebub, climbed onto the sweet table and unceremoniously started devouring a three-tiered cake as if it were a simple breakfast. He plunged his snout straight into the middle of the cake, spreading icing everywhere, while one of the waiters tried futilely to push him away with a napkin. The problem with people who have never dealt with goats is that they don't understand that they're not like cats or dogs. They don't learn from scolding. They don't obey shouts, and, above all, they don't get scared by sudden movements. In fact, they like chaos. The more people ran, shouted, and tried to chase them away, the more excited they became. A woman in high heels tried to clap her hands to scare away one of the goats that was chewing on a piece of fabric from the main table. What she didn't expect was that the goat would interpret this as a challenge. He raised his head, faced the woman, and without warning, lunged straight at her leg. The heel broke. The woman fell sideways, causing a glass of champagne to fly up and splash into the face of a gentleman, who, until then, had been trying to keep his composure. He indignantly threw his hands up and stomped off, saying something about lack of respect. Meanwhile, the goat that had won the battle against the heel was already chewing off a piece of the hem of her dress. Karen finally stood up and came marching towards me, her eyes wide with fury. "Do something!" she shouted. Oh, of course. Now I had to solve her problem. I crossed my arms, looking around as if I were assessing the landscape. "Well," I said, thoughtful, "I'd say it's pretty authentic. Didn't you want a country wedding?" She turned red with hatred. "You let these monsters out on purpose." I feigned indignation. "What do you mean? They're just my animals, on my property, enjoying life. It's not my fault they enjoyed the party." Her despair was a beautiful thing to behold. She looked around, seeing her dream wedding crumbling before her eyes, and finally realized that there was no solution. She had no security, no authority, no power that could make the goats simply disappear. She turned to her fiancé, hoping he would do something, but he just shrugged his shoulders in frustration. "I told you we should have rented a real place." The sentence fell like a bucket of cold water. For the first time, Karen seemed to realize that perhaps she was to blame for all this. But of course, she wasn't going to admit it. And that's when, with no other option, she snapped. She picked up a plate from the floor and threw it at one of the goats. Big mistake. Firstly, because the goat dodged with the calmness of someone who has survived storms, electric fences, and farmer chases. Secondly, because now he was angry. The goat, one of the youngest and most energetic, took aim at Karen and shot in her direction. The guests screamed. The bride tried to run, but it was too late. The goat hit her right in the ass, sending her crashing to the ground, sliding a few meters in the dirt as her white dress became unrecognizable. The silence that followed was simply perfect. Karen just lay there on the ground, saying nothing, taking deep breaths, and trying to come to terms with reality. The guests were shocked. The groom covered his face with his hand. And me? Well, I took a sip of my coffee and let out a long, satisfied, "Too authentic, right?" Then, the ceremony was over for good. The guests began to leave as quickly as possible, trying to get rid of the mess. The bridesmaids tried to help Karen up, but she just lay there, hugging the earth as if she had given up on life. The goats, satisfied, finally lost interest and started wandering back home. The damage had already been done. And me? Well, I just wonder how she thought it would work out. But of course, it wasn't over yet, because the next day, Karen decided she was going to call the police. When Karen was knocked down by the goat and lay there on the ground, motionless, covered in dirt, her wedding dress completely ruined, I thought it was over. I thought she was finally going to understand that life doesn't work the way she imagines it does, that she can't just take possession of what isn't hers and get away with it. But no, because Karen was made of something special, a rare material that combined stubbornness, arrogance, and a complete lack of sense of reality. The next day, while I was quietly feeding the animals and laughing alone as I remembered her desperate face, a police car pulled up at the entrance to the farm. Ah, but of course, the woman had the audacity to call the police. I leaned against the fence and waited for the officers to get out of the car. There were two men in uniform, with the faces of a few friends, those who have probably seen it all and have no more patience for nonsense. The first, an older policeman, took off his sunglasses and got straight to the point. We had received a report of vandalism and aggression against a guest at a wedding. I held back my laughter. That was a good one. Assault? The other policeman flipped through a notepad. The complaint says that you released dangerous animals to sabotage a wedding, and that one of the animals attacked the event organizer. Well, technically that was true, but it was also completely ridiculous. I crossed my arms and shook my head, feigning a worried expression. Oh, I see. The organizer must be Karen, right? The policemen looked at each other. I could already see on their faces that they weren't quite convinced that they were dealing with a real case. Yes, I nodded, sighing as if it were a big problem. So, here's the thing. She organized this wedding on my property without permission. I didn't authorize anything. She just decided she could set everything up here as if she owned the land. They both raised their eyebrows at the same time. Can you prove that? I smiled. Now it was getting interesting. Of course. I took out my cell phone and opened the videos I had recorded from the beginning. I showed the moment I arrived at the venue and found everything set up without my consent. Then I showed the wedding starting, the guests entering, and then the big show, the exact moment when the goats invaded the ceremony. The policemen tried to maintain a professional attitude, but I saw the corner of one of their mouths twitch, holding back laughter as one of the goats jumped on the table and started devouring the wedding cake. I continued playing the videos, showing Karen running around, trying to control the disaster. But the best was yet to come. The grand finale, Karen being knocked to the ground by the goat. I paused the video exactly at the moment of impact. The first policeman let out a little pft and cleared his throat, trying to disguise his laughter. The second couldn't hold it in and let out a short laugh before resuming his serious expression. "Right," said the older man, wiping his eyes. "So, you're telling me that she invaded your land, set up a wedding without permission, and now wants to accuse you of assault because a goat hit her?" "Exactly." He looked at his colleague and let out a long sigh, like someone who's tired of dealing with stupid people. "Okay, let's talk to her." I waited there, satisfied, while they got back into the car and drove to Karen's house, which was a few streets away. It wasn't long before I heard hysterical screams coming from there. "He did it on purpose! He unleashed these monsters to ruin me!" The policeman tried to argue, but Karen was Karen. She didn't know when to stop. "You need to arrest him. He owes thousands of dollars in damages." Ah, that was a new one. Thousands of dollars. Now I was curious to know how much she had spent on this mess. The officers talked to her for a few more minutes, but in the end, logic won out. After all, what Karen had done was trespassing. If anyone had to be arrested there, it was her. And that's exactly what happened. The great Karen of the HOA was escorted to the car, screaming and screaming, saying that she was going to sue me, that I would never have peace again, that I was a monster. The neighbors came out to watch the spectacle. Some filmed it. Others just crossed their arms and smiled contentedly. I just stood on the balcony, sipping my coffee and enjoying the moment. Did she get stuck? Of course not. It wasn't serious enough. But she had to pay a fine. She had to compensate the suppliers she hired and who never received the money. And, above all, she had to live with the public humiliation of having been defeated by an invasion of goats. In the days that followed, every time I passed her house, I saw that someone had thrown a bag of goat feed through the door or hung a farm bell on the gate. It became the town joke, and she never tried to mess with me again. Because now, every time Karen sees me, she remembers the day she lost the most absurd battle of her life. And above all, she remembers the goat that destroyed her dream wedding. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave your like and comment below. Turturturl.